So just to explain a bit where this talk is coming from, I've been interested in the issue of cognitive penetration and how higher level contents can influence what we see for quite a while now. I've published several papers on the issue, but the debate has really been reshaped because of the new discussions regarding the difference between perception and cognition, especially linked to predictive coding accounts. And so today what I want to present is not a fully fleshed account, but the kind of new direction that my thinking has been taking regarding the issue of cognitive penetration within these new discussions of the cognition perception divide. And I want to start with a brief and probably too brief summary of what predictive coding accounts are and why they matter for the issue of cognitive penetration. And if you wanted to go into details, you would have to look really at a series of papers which have followed a very important publication in 1999 by Ballard and colleagues, showing that even the lower sensory areas, visual areas, for instance, as early as V1, are actually receiving top-down influences and that modulate their activity and their responses to stimuli. And this type of evidence since 1999 has been really accumulating and completed by various neuroscientific and modeling attempts, leading to this idea that all the way through from the highest level to the lowest level of perception, what we have is always an interplay between some top-down predictions and some incoming information. What you will have then is that at every level, the incoming information will be matched to the prediction, and only the difference between the prediction and this incoming information will be fed forward to the next level. Here it's embedded in a diagram of the brain to show that there is a lot of neuroscientific evidence to back this up, but I think that what you can extract is philosophically for our understanding of processing in the brain is more like the sketch that you can borrow from Lopien and Clark. That is, what you have between perception and the highest level of cognition is this series of hierarchical levels where basically every level predicts with more and more specificity what the lower level will actually provide, whereas the lower level sends, as I said, the resulting error that comes of which is calculated from the mismatch between the prediction and the incoming signal. I'm not sure how familiar everybody is in the room, but I expect to be here on a Good Friday. People must be quite aware of what predictive coding means. Now, what is interesting here in the success of this account, both in the neuroscience and in the philosophical landscape, is that most of the proponents of these models have predicted that they mark the end of the cognition-perception divide. And I've just here extracted a few representative quotes. This is from Chris Friis and Friston, so from the neuroscience side, who note in their 2013 paper that within this framework, referring to predictive coding, there is no qualitative distinction between perception and belief, since both involve making inferences about the state of the world and taking into account evidence. I have a slight issue with my slide being hidden by your. Oh, that's okay. That's fine. Sorry about that. And another here quote borrowed this time from Andy Clark, who has written extensively about the philosophical consequences of the predictive coding accounts. Clark says that this account makes the line between perception and cognition fuzzy, and we don't have a real distinction between perception and belief anymore, but more a mix of differences. Lapien, also in a later paper looking at the cognition perception divide, here says that we need to support a full collapse of the divide. Now, these are only quotes, and of course it's difficult to do justice to each author's argument and single line. One thing to notice here is that sometimes in some of these papers it's hard to see exactly what the authors have as their main target, whether it's the notion of distinction between perception and cognition as the independent, or whether it's the notion of distinction in terms of our capacity to provide a single definition that will isolate or uniquely characterize perception versus cognition. The reason why I've chosen the three quotes above is that they seem to be representative of the second kind, that is the fact that what is missing, according to them, once we adopt the predictive coding accounts, is the very possibility to draw a difference between perception and cognition based on the fact that both integrate what used to be the characteristic of perception, bottom-up information, and what we used to see as a distinctive role of cognition, that is the capacity to send predictions. So there's something along this line that these authors seem to signal here. My claim here is that actually the quotes are strongly driven by the key interest of the people here, which is to be able to provide a definition of what makes perception special. And it's true that if you look in this diagram, and the lower part of the diagram, what used to be the privileged domain of perception, that is the fact that they would only have systems processing information in bottom-up fashion, now it becomes very difficult to have the same definition because of, as I said, the well-evidenced importance of prediction at its earliest stages. But what happens here is that one can still turn their eyes to the upper level, and that's what I try to do in the paper, and I want to encourage you just trivially to do. And looking at the upper level, that is what occupies the role of cognition, or the highest level of the cognitive system that we can call thought, then what you can notice here is that although all levels indeed receive information from the level below, so every level has now this characteristic of receiving information from below, and that all the levels will integrate top-down expectations right from the beginning, that very top level doesn't. And that's where I borrowed the title from. Basically, there is a way in which, in this account, you could say that every level is predicted by the level above, except for the very top one. There is a level which is unpredicted and more fundamentally unpredictable, because it has nothing above it to sort of generate these expectations. So here you can see it just following from this organization, there is a way in which you can sort of isolate a characteristic of the higher level. And what I want to claim is that we're entitled to call this upper level the highest level in the processing, the high level cognition, or the level of thought. And I will use the two expressions indifferently. Now, from this observation, which is a suggestion that we can still cling to the distinction between perception and cognition, if you want, not from below but from above with these accounts, there are various problems that arise once you think about things this way. And I want just to describe three of them and the way I'm currently thinking about them. The first one is to say, well, that's, as I said, drawing from this trivial observation of the diagram of the supposed organization, of the hierarchy of prediction and feed-forward processing, we still don't have a really substantial definition of thought. It's just a negative one, something which is not predicted or predictable. I still think that the boundary here between a negative definition and a substantial one is actually very thin. I think it's actually something where you can derive a substantial idea that thought is the only level or only kind of processing which controls and predicts, but is not itself controlled or predicted. So you can transform the negative properties into positive ones. Now, in this framework, we can also extract further, I think, characteristics of thoughts. As I said, as every other level, it will receive the error signals that results from the mismatch between the prediction it sends to the level immediately below and what this level has been processing. But surely, if that's the only way in which we think about the way to update thought in this account, on this diagram, then there are two major risks. One is to say that just in virtue of being a proponent of predictive coding, one has to be a pure empiricist, the idea that thought is only updated by perceptual evidence or what is coming from the lower level and sensory levels. The second risk is the risk of solipsism, because it seems that the only way in which, again, thought will be updated or changed or shaped is by one's own incoming information resulting from the interplay of predictions and sensory information. Now, I actually had recently a chat with Carl Friston about whether it was a solid system. Actually, I think he might actually be ready to bite the bullet, but I don't think it follows, and I think there are many ways in which we can fit other characteristics of thoughts in this account that don't oblige us to accept this radical empiricism and solipsism. The fact here is that we can fit actually two types of updating still to make the account more complete, and show that this higher level, besides being changed or updated by the incoming perceptual information, can also update itself via two main ways. One is its own conscious monitoring, what one could call metacognition or reflective cognition. So there is a property of reflexivity. And the second is the property of being updated via the comparison between the horizontal updating, if you wish, the comparison between some contents of thoughts and some other thoughts. Here, the key case, of course, will be the capacity for thought in humans to be updated by thought that are linguistically communicated by others. I have to actually make a slight sort of addition to something which was not in the paper. I think here, by granting these properties of updating via reflectivity and horizontal updating, especially via linguistic communication to thought, I'm of course focusing on human thought. It is really a possibility within the predictive account frameworks and the first distinction to think that, on the contrary, when you turn to animal thought, then we will have strongly empiricist and even solipsist ways in which this upper level is actually updated. So the definition of thought I'm talking about is, of course, here the human one. Now, the benefits of this way of thinking about the definition of thought, a way of distinguishing thought from other types of processing, I think it's indeed that it is relatively elegant in its need to only appeal to processing characteristics. the project I have in mind, or the broader picture I have in mind here, is the possibility to isolate what makes the highest level of cognition distinctive, uniquely in terms of ways of being updated. And in the case of human thought, as I said, the reflective updating and the horizontal updating might be specifically characteristic of thought. Because it appeals to processing characteristics and ways of updating, I also think this is actually something which promises to be amenable to empirical investigation, and something that you can actually also model quite well. So that's the kind of generally views I'm interested in, and I expect people in the neural mechanisms are interested in as well. Now, I also think that this definition shows, this full definition of thought shows that we need to think that there is at least one level in the human mind and brain that is not just governed by the only norm of minimizing error from a moment-to-moment perspective. The two other ways of updating, that is the reflective aspect and the linguistic communication, are not just driven by error minimization in the sense of being able to provide more accuracy for the next iteration of predicting the next signals. But these two levels can be sensitive to other epistemic norms that as philosophers we would have a hard time giving up on, something like consistency, for instance. By reflectivity, you can actually make sure that you're consistent with your own decisions, and by comparing thoughts with others or within yourself, you can also check not only accuracy, but also consistency. So I think that's one benefit of this type of account for predictive coding, not to have a strict equivalence between accepting the account and thinking that the only thing that drives the system is the quest for more accuracy regarding the next predictions. Second problem for this framework, granting that now you're fully satisfied with the characterization of thought that I've given to you, a question that you may ask is that, okay, so now we have this upper level, which is thought, so do you have to call all the rest perception? And here I want to say that the response doesn't follow in this account. Why? Because it would be the case, it would be a trivial implication if there were only two levels, and you want one to be cognition and you want somewhere something to be perception. But here, according to the latest count, there's something between 5 and 7 levels of processing for visual scene perception, for instance. So the fact that you call the upper one thought or cognition or high-level cognition doesn't entail that the 6 others or the 4 others need to be called perceptual. Now, obviously, it's an empirical question how many levels one should recognize and how these levels should be individuated regarding to neuroscientific and modeling criteria. So that's something I'm interested in looking at, but it's a work in progress, how to individuate levels. But surely it is, the account I'm putting forward is compatible with recognizing that we need an intermediate type between cognition and perception. Maybe they're a gray area that we cannot just fit into our demand for concept of perception, and still, in virtue of what I said is the distinctive characteristic of thought, will not be accommodated in that under that label. But I do think that as far as I'm concerned, as I was saying, the question was about the distinction versus the definition. I'm more interested in the capacity to sort of provide here a definition of thought than really sorting how the definition of perception will go. Now, I really don't want to minimize the importance of this question. There are many, I think, accounts on the market that could be accommodated within what I want to do, that is something that sticks to processing characteristics and could still provide us with ways to check which of these levels we want to characterize as perception and which we might not want to characterize as perception. I'm thinking here as I'm thinking about processing characteristics such as, for instance, some properties of habituation, which you will find only at lower perceptual levels, as Ned Block has argued in his forthcoming book. And there are also properties in terms of timing or speed of processing that have been suggested that really could still work for providing a substantial definition of perception, a way to distribute the levels between perception and or not in that framework. So obviously this second problem, I'm aware that this is packed with pitfalls and difficulties, but as I said, it has more to do with some of the implications of the account than the consistency of the account, which has to do with the capacity to provide a distinctive definition for thought. Now, the third type of problems, and whenever I've presented this account, that certainly or come up in discussion, is how this proposal relates to the more traditional, the dominant way of drawing the perception-cognition distinction, which is in terms of content. Most of the time, the debate has recognized that you will have a form of distinctive content either for the cognitive or the perceptual side along the conceptual, non-conceptual line, or otherwise in terms of formats, and here in terms of analog or digital formats. Now, as I said, I think it's a strength and a benefit from my perspective that you don't seem to need in the first instance to mention content in order to be able to isolate and distinguish cognition. Now, of course, it doesn't mean that because this is not necessary, you can try and draw the distinction without it. At some point, you're not faced with the problem to say, well, don't you have necessarily to appeal to content as well to provide a full definition? And here you might ask questions such as, well, it seems that for the kind of updating that I consider necessary for the definition of thought, that is linguistic updating and reflective updating, types of content are necessary for this updating to take place. I would say that it surely does once we take into account linguistic communication, so what needs to be conveyed verbally and or the way you will interpret the utterances will be by mapping words into concepts. So I think here that kind of updating is necessarily conceptual. But I don't think it's yet settled that the way in which the updating, either from perception or from the immediate, sorry, I should say, by perceptual updating, I mean the updating from the level immediately below the upper level of thought, needs to be taking place via conceptual updating. Nor do I think it's settled that the reflective, the sort of metacognitive monitoring needs to be done along using conceptual resources. I could develop this in discussion if needed. So to conclude here on this problem, I don't think that one, in a way, would have a perfect mapping between the kind of distinction that I draw and the kind of distinctions that are drawn along content or format views. But it seems that at least for some updatings, then we will agree with the proponents of the content views or the format views that these are characteristic of thought. Okay, so that's for the theoretical framework and the idea that now you have in mind this definition of thought. So by contrast with some authors who have adopted the predictive account, I still think that we should still worry about the issue of cognitive penetration, whether cognition influences perception that predictive accounts haven't made this question trivial or disappear because everything is influenced by everything. But surely that has consequences for the way we need to think about the problem. And in order to make these consequences a bit more visible and also to connect to some other part of my work, which has to do with conducting experiments in collaboration with scientists, I want to focus this second part of the talk on a distinctive effect that was much mentioned in the literature as a very problematic case for cognitive penetration. This is the example that you might be familiar with, documented as a face-lightness bias, and this was the evidence for this perceptual effect was first documented by Levin and Banerjee in 2006, and many papers have followed, running variants and as we'll see sometimes problematic replications of this effect. But basically the effect for people who are not that familiar with it is the following. It's really exactly in front of you. What you can see here on the screen, depending on the quality, the effect might or might not be that strong, is a series of faces which have simply been morphed through a morphing software. So has to reflect different degrees of African or European morphology. So at the very left, what you have is what the software considered as the prototypical African morphology, and on the right, you will have the prototypical European morphology. In the middle, you have various hybrids from 80% to 20%, and 40 and 60 on both sides. So I think that's pretty clear that the morphology of these faces is changing, but if you look at them, I hope that from your screens, you, and usually you would ask the room, but here, as I was born, I'm alone, you should see, hopefully, that the face on the left, the full African morphology one, looks darker in skin color than the face on the extreme right. So what you have here is normally a sort of shade of gray from the African full 100% African morphology to the 100% European, going from darker to lighter perceptually. Now, if this effect applies, that's you get the effect because the bias is here due to the morphology itself. The luminance, the average luminance of all of these faces is actually controlled to be exactly the same. So although the face looks darker or lighter, when you look at the average luminance in terms of pixels for these various stimuli, it's exactly controlled to be similar. The authors of the 2006 paper actually report that the way they found the effect was sort of by mistake, because their postdoc actually was in charge of generating faces with various luminance and various morphology, and messed up the labeling of the stimuli and then couldn't find again which one was which. And so they were looking and sometimes being convinced by the labels on each image that they were exactly supposed to look of the same luminance. They would say, no, this can't be right. And they went on and on to realize that this bias was actually affecting their perception. This is a very sort of cheeky way of trying to convince you that the luminance is the same. It's like I delete the morphology. Hopefully, here you will see that the striking graded nature of these faces disappears. Now, of course, the bias itself was not then measured through this kind of direct comparison. There is a very classic process that enabled the authors to document this bias, which is a matching task where participants were presented with a target face and a response face from either African or European morphology. And the target face was varying in 5 degrees of luminance, and the task of the participants was always to adjust the response face so as for it to look exactly of the same shade of gray. And And through repeated experiments and measures, the authors managed to show that overall, when the target face is presented with black morphology or African morphology, then the match on the response side was significantly different toward the darker shade. The second aspect of that paper, which really leads the authors to conclude to a conceptual origin, that is the fact that it's not just the morphology itself, but the way in which this morphology is further interpreted as African, therefore black, and European, therefore white, comes from a second experiment where this time they presented the participants with some intermediate faces of hybrid morphology or ambivalent morphologically. And they presented the same face with the same luminance, accompanied either by the label black or the label white. And this time again, they observed the tendency to match the face labeled as black as being darker as the same ambivalent face labeled as white. So here they really introduced the linguistic terms to show that the influence is similar, and from there they conclude that the previous experimental results must have been driven by a similar cognitive influence. I'm not here going to discuss how sound this cumulative evidence is. I want just to move to what this paper has done to the philosophical community in terms of convincing people that they had found a very robust case of cognitive penetration. Indeed, what is nice about this effect, by contrast with the ones that were discussed in the previous literature, is that it's clearly an influence of something on the content of perception. That is the effect is just immediately visible. I showed it to you on the first slides. And because of this role of the linguistic labels, it's very tempting indeed to think that what we think, the kind of labels that we give to these faces, given the morphology, is responsible for this change in what we see. What two authors who have replicated or conducted replications or variants of this experiment note is that actually this effect is probably the only one where people can really experience by themselves the effect of cognition on stimuli. It's not a contrived situation of perception, and some other effects are out there to actually interpret philosophically because they're of their contrived nature, especially. Now, because of this sort of being in full view, it's also not easy to actually reduce them, as many people have done for other experiments, including myself, to reduce them as being only an effect of what you think on how you interpret what you perceive and not really on what you perceive. This one is harder to do, to run through this kind of objections. Because the displays are also in full view and you have time to look at them as much as you want, it would be very difficult to attribute them to differences in attention. To my knowledge, nobody has conducted experiment looking at eye tracking data, whether people actually scan faces in the same way, depending on the morphology. But I think that it's unlikely, highly unlikely, that differences in attention would explain the effect. So what you have here is the perfect case for what I call the classic content definition of cognitive penetration. A case where you can say, well, we have higher level cognitive content, things like beliefs such as, and I will come back to that, but beliefs such as recognizing this is an African face, and the second belief is that Africans tend to be darker skinned than Europeans, and this belief would influence the way you perceive the face. So the higher level cognitive content will change the content of perception, and in a way which is content sensitive. The belief says it should be darker, and your perception exhibit that very same this tendency to make the face looks as darker. Now, in the paper, I detail why I think still that this classic, especially with this example, this classic content view of cognitive penetration, actually, although they point in an interesting direction, just by sticking to a very content-driven view of the debate, still sort of face a series of challenges that are not easy to overcome. The first one is the challenge of being more specific regarding exactly the kind of influencer that is responsible for the effect. And here, when I said a challenge to propose something which is theoretically consistent with the idea of cognitive penetration and can still be backed up by the empirical evidence that is available. Now, in the case of the face-lightness bias, what is really difficult is that if you try the most obvious candidate for cognitive influence, that is belief, and that's the candidate I just mentioned as an example, there is no clear evidence that any explicit measure of what we call racial essentialist attitudes, or the fact that people really strongly believe that there are big boundaries between Africans and Europeans, explains the strength of the effect. So people, even without this explicit beliefs that there are strong differences between Africans and Europeans, will show the effect. So that's one problem. One response to this problem would be to say that the questionnaires that are administered to measure how strongly people believe in differences actually don't target really the kind of physiognomic and skin color differences that are tested in this effect, which is a fair point. But I think a more serious problem for any account which would try to explain this effect in terms of the explicit beliefs that the perceivers have, would have to find contents of belief which are as fine-grained and parametric as the effect. And what the example shows, and that's why I walked you through the details of the experiment, is that it's really a question of how pronounced the morphological differences and how the brightness level evolve. So what you would have to grant to the perceiver in terms of explicit belief would be more of the form of the more pronounced the African facial features, the darker the skin color is. And reciprocally, the more pronounced the European features of this individual, of an individual are, the lighter the skin will be. And it seems very unlikely that these are the kind of explicit beliefs that any person who has been around the variety of faces that they are outside will be able to have such a graded, perfectly linear version of the belief. Again, these are not there ways in which someone could come up with a defense of some content of explicit beliefs, but I still think they tend to lead to very problematic attributions. Now, one could choose to go to another level than the explicit beliefs and especially target implicit beliefs or implicit attitudes, things that can be measured, for instance, using the implicit association tests. But here one issue is that even if someone finds a correlation between the strength of performance on an implicit association test and the strength or the susceptibility to this perceptual bias, it's still not clear that this candidate counts really strongly as a cognitive candidate. You would have to do quite a lot of substantiation to count things that are measured by implicit association tests, which are associations between labels and quite often images, as counting as the full cognitive candidates that people are after. A third issue in the debate, once people adopt the kind of classic framing of the problem, is to address the growing evidence that there are differences between the stimuli that play a role in the perception of faces as darker or lighter. And here I want to go slightly into more detail. This evidence came from a paper by Firestone and Shaw in 2015, where basically what they did is to take the two extreme phases of the experiment by Levin and Banerjee and blur them through adding some filters. So what you have is what is displayed on the screen. Instead of the two clear faces, A and B, you have the two same faces but blurred. The two faces on the side of A, you have the two blurred faces on the side of B. And what they did is to present these faces again in the same way to participants. There are interesting variants in the experiment they run, but still what they found is that when asked to match these blurred faces to equally blurred stimuli in terms of their darkness or lightness, the effect was still observed. That is, the face on the left side, which corresponds to the blurred version of the African face, was still matched to a darker shade than the face on the right, which corresponds to the blurred version of the European face. Now, according to them, what we can see here is much more what we observe in the case of issues that have been documented on the various lightness and darkness contrast effects. So I just displayed two of these effects. On the figure with the horizontal stripes, what you see here is that the gray vertical stripe looks lighter than the one on the right, although they are of the same luminance, because of the way it immediately coexist with dark or white shades. The same effect is here documented on the second figure on the right side. And again, what you will have is the tendency to perceive the two square as not being of the same luminance, but one being darker and lighter because of the immediate proximity of darker or lighter shades. In the same way, you can go back to the blurred stimuli and think that what is happening here is not due to the recognition of faces as African or European, because now it's no longer available according to what Firestone and Shaw tested. But what happens is that the way the pixel is distributed as being more or less densely packed in terms of darker and lighter will generate this overall effect of one face looking darker and the other lighter. Something which has to do with the distribution of luminance rather than the recognition provided by the morphology. So they conclude that the recognition, the role of any, forget whether it's belief or concepts here, any higher level cognitive content is here eliminated according to their design, and yet the differences of stimuli still lead to a similar effect. So there is no need to appeal to cognitive influence to explain this. Now, there's quite a few moves that have been made since the publication of this paper, including by the initial Harvard group that published the first experiments. Some of them have to do with difficulties of replicating what Firestone and Shaw did, so I will bracket that because that's more of an empirical debate. But let's grant that this stands as a robust finding. What Levin and Banerjee have pointed is even if the participants were not consciously detecting the differences in the faces and could not really report them as being African and European, it's still possible that the faces were unconsciously recognized as such. So here it's another sort of distinction. It's not just the implicit nature of the recognition, but just to say there could be unconscious activation of concepts or beliefs, saying this is an African face and this is a European one. The second thing that I want to point at is that the experiment that Firestone and Shaw have run is doesn't exactly count as a perfect control of Levin and Banerjee. That is, they've run a variant where a similar effect is observed when you don't have recognition of explicit recognition of facial features. But what they really should have done in order to push the argument further is to show that once you introduce the morphological features again with the same participants, then there's no difference with what the strength of the effect was in the case of the blurry faces. Unless we have this strict comparison showing that the effect is exactly of the same strength independently of the availability of the morphology or not, it's still very difficult to say that, well, when the morphology happens, then you still have this lower level differences. They still explain part of the effect, but the availability of the morphology triggers the cognitive influences that are documented by Levin and Banerjee, and look, the effect now is stronger. So unless we have this comparison, I think it's very difficult to absolutely rule out that Levin and Banerjee can have a point regarding cognitive influences. So that's where the evidence goes so far, and in a way, what is a benefit of moving the debate about this specific case to the predictive coding framework is that regarding this last point, the fact that after all, it is probable that there are low-level differences responsible for the strength of the effect, within a predictive coding account, there is no problem sort of integrating the role of bottom-up processing with top-down all the way down at the level of early level of brightness processing. So the second benefit, so the first benefit would be, say, once you're a predictive coding account, then you're fine with saying it's both top-down and bottom-up, and we're happy with that. I think that you could make the move with a classic view about cognitive penetration as well. But the main benefit here is that what you have is, sorry, I'm lagging on my slides, is a question of, you could see whether the objective differences in the stimuli explain all the effects by comparison with the higher level prediction, by comparison with another level of prediction, which is much more proximate and much more immediately related to the early sensory levels. In a way, what you can do is to switch what used to be a very categorical debate in terms of does thought or cognition influence perception, to a much more graded version of the problem, which is how much can we say that this effect is due actually to cognition versus first bottom-up initial differences in the sensory stimuli, or immediate predictions which are not cognitive ones. Now, having this graded version is certainly makes the problem, I think, more robust, and something we can investigate hand in hand with cognitive neuroscientists more thoroughly than the categorical yes or no. But it will be no trivial matter to do so, because establishing exactly which weight each level has on a certain effect is not trivial, especially because the weighting is strongly linked in this account to precision and attention. So what I want to present then is a kind of shot at a way in which I think we can still make sense of the question and test it empirically, adopting the predictive coding accounts and the kind of framework that I've argued for. So that's actually what we try to do with this very specific effect, looking at basically our two hypotheses regarding the nature of thought. That is the fact that it is characterized by two specific kinds of updating, not exhaustively, but characteristically. The one being that it's updated by linguistic communication, as I said, and the second, it can be accessible to conscious monitoring. Now, the hypothesis is to say, by manipulating linguistic communication and asking participants to perform conscious monitoring during a task similar to the lightness, the face-lightness bias, we can be sure that we are manipulating the level of thought, and we can see whether by manipulating the level of thought it makes a big difference on the perceptual effect that is of interest here. And this is a way of presenting basically the prediction. So according to the first idea is, if really thought has a large influence on this effect, then by providing through linguistic communication some instructions to the participant, you should see that because you've changed this cognitive prediction, you will change the effect a lot. If on the contrary, thought has no influence or very little influence, you will see no significant change once you've changed that level of thought through an updating by verbal instruction. In the similar way, if you ask participants to actually consciously monitor their perceptual decisions, their perceptual judgments, and I will tell you more about how it's done, then you should actually see whether thought has a good influence on the effect or not. I'm aware that I'm running a bit close to time limit, so I will go fast from now. So these are the two manipulations that we conducted in conjunction with two scientists, Owen Travers and Murray Fairhurst. And we ran basically a variant of the face-lightness version, where this time the faces were presented shortly one after the other, and the participants had to indicate whether the response face, which was the second, was darker or lighter than the first one. So it's almost similar to a matching task, but this time the stimuli are presented in series, which give us especially some response time data, which are a bit more interesting for our purpose. Now, what we did in the first experiment was to provide the participants first with 70 trials, and then we stopped all of them in the middle. And to a third of them, what we said is to say, well, there is a problem here because your first performance shows that you're influenced by racial biases. You characterize faces in terms of their ethnicity. So please now try to do better. And then we administer 70 other trials. To a second group, after 70 trials, they were stopped, but this time they were told more neutrally that their response were biased by the morphology. So we didn't this time sort of manipulate the guilt aspects by appealing to racial biases, but just neutrally described their bias. So the third group, which was our control, we stopped them after 70 trials as well, but this time we said, oh, you know, you seem to be getting tired, please breathe and do better. So all were encouraged to do better, but some were encouraged by us instructing them that they were biased, where the others were not. And these are the stimuli that we used. What you can see on this slide is, I will just briefly describe, is the fact that only the participants which were instructed about their bias, either through the racial bias manipulation or the neutral bias manipulation, showed a significant decrease, that the participants who were instructed showed a significant decrease by contrast with the control participants who only received the instructions to do better. So all participants, that's to be expected because of practice. They tend to show less and less bias. But there was a very strong drop in the after and before condition, the pre-test, post-test, for the two groups who were instructed. And I think we were the first to demonstrate actually that a very simple instruction would change this bias, which really pleads in favor of thought playing an important role in controlling and modifying this bias. Now, something here to mention is that a possible interpretation here would be that the participants who received the instructions about their biases actually didn't change really in terms of their perception, but what they did, they were more careful, and they sort of were perceiving the same thing, but were inhibiting their first response and being more critical and correcting. But here, what we have is, because of the response time, we can show that it didn't take longer than the control or than what's predicted by the evolution of response time through the experiment to perform these decisions. Whereas if they had to sort of perceive and then stop and correct and criticize, they should actually take longer. And we have further data looking at more fine-grained response time characteristics that suggest that really it is a very early correction that happens. So that was the first finding. The second manipulation that we did was this time to ask participants to be more reflective on their decision. The way it's usually done in the literature, and I've done quite a lot of work on this, is to look at how confident people will be in their perceptual decisions. So instead of just deciding whether the second phase was darker or lighter, participants were also encouraged to say how confident they were that their response was correct. And here there is also good evidence in the literature that we can actually perform this judgment of confidence pretty well in the case of the accuracy of our perceptual decisions. It's tested on very simple visual stimuli and other types of stimuli everywhere in psychology labs. There is also, more interestingly and maybe more relevant here, evidence that we can also monitor in the same way when actually our behavior conflicts with our sort of more generic dispositions or attitudes. So if you ask about your preferences, your general preferences for types of snacks, let's say you prefer apples to crisps, but then you're presented with an apple and a crisp and you choose the crisp, and you say, how sure were you that was the right decision, then people actually report lower confidence that they made the right choice. So it seems that we're also capable of monitoring the conflict between our behavior and our higher level attitudes. Now, here, by encouraging the participants to reflect on their confidence, we thought, well, if there is any role that higher level cognition plays, then it should show up in terms of difference in confidence. That is, for the cases where participants are more biased because the morphology is very pronounced, then they should be less confident that they have made the correct response. And cases where the response was purely driven by the difference in luminance, say when the two faces were exactly of the same morphology, then they should be much more confident of their response. So they should be able to monitor the accuracy of their responses. The prediction here you see on the top of the screen, that is, if there is no such higher level awareness, reflective awareness, then actually confidence will be flat. Everything, independently of whether participants were biased by morphology or not, their response will simply be predicted by how easy or difficult it was to detect the luminance difference between the two faces, which is what is on the x-axis. Whereas if there is an availability for metacognitive awareness, you would predict that the more there is this difference in the morphology, the more confident or less confident participants will be. What you see on the lower part are both our explicit and implicit measures of awareness. That is, how confident people reported they were and how also fast or slow they were in responding, or hesitant or not hesitant. And you can see that the two perfectly sort of present the same sort of collapse of all the conditions. That is, participants were not distinctively aware of any influence of the morphology over and above the fact that they were more confident when this was an easy difference in terms of luminance and a difficult difference in terms of luminance to detect. So there is no clear sign that people were aware, when invited to reflect on their decision, that they used morphology at all. So I'm coming to the last two slides here. The first one is the sort of empirical conclusion so far. So, and this is one aspect when you want to take your philosophy of cognitive science to the cognitive science side, is that things don't line up. So on the one hand, what the experiments that we conducted has shown is that it seems that thought has a big influence when you look at it regarding the possibility of changing thoughts through updating by linguistic communication. But as far as of reflective awareness is concerned, there was no sign that thought was capable of monitoring any influence, making it less clear that it was tapping into this introspective capacity of thought. So, general conclusion this time, what I hope I've shown in the first part and on this Good Friday is that you can accept predictive coding accounts and still hold on to the perception-cognition divide. Maybe not from the lower part, but at least certainly from the upper part, by seeing that thought remains distinctive. I think it's a benefit here that we can look at the problem with a sort of more mechanistic processing view that is looking at ways in which thought is distinctively updated that characterize this level. And we can also still question whether thought has an influence on perception, but this time making it a question of grade and not this kind of categorical yes, no, it had a role. On the more speculative part, coming from the empirical evidence that I've presented in the second part, what I showed here is that it seems that this, in case in this bias, not all of this is sensitive to a different kind of characteristic of updating of thought. When you ask people to do differently through linguistic communication, it works. When you ask them to sort of do differently by asking them to be more reflective, it doesn't show up. And the more speculative claim I want to put forward, that maybe we should not necessarily, and that's the direction I'm thinking in at the moment, that necessarily what we will find in this upper level is of the same kind. That is, that the same kind of updating will target the same time of processing. And here I'm thinking more along the line of saying that maybe there is some aspects of that these predictions at the higher level which are responsive to linguistic communication, and some which are not, and vice versa, some which are responsive to reflective updating and some which are not, which would lead to something like maybe putting an S at cognition and or a S at thought, thinking that there is thought for control and thought for reflection, and that these two can come apart. So that's the very speculative part and conclusion. I really hope that it has stimulated some thought in the commentators and the attendants. Thank you for your attention, and thanks for the work done by the two postdocs as well. Thank you.